It was a morning like any other, but the air seemed heavy, as if the world itself knew the pain Margaret was about to endure. As she stood at the doorstep, her worn boots digging into the earth she had grown up on, her father's silence was the loudest thing in the room. Her mother's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the silence. "You brought shame on this family. It's time you leave." Margaret's heart sank. Her younger sister, Ruth, stood at the window, watching the scene with a smug expression, her words a final sting. "At least now I can find a proper husband." Margaret had always been different. Widowed at 21, her life had never gone as she had hoped. Now, at 26, a doctor had called her barren, unable to bear children. In a town where lineage and family were everything, her inability to fulfill her role as a mother made her the perfect target for scorn. And so, without a second thought, her family had decided a one-way ticket west to the unknown, where she could be out of their sight, out of their minds. The family home, a modest but well-kept house, had once been full of life, laughter, and dreams for the future. Margaret had imagined marrying young, having children, and carrying on the family name. Instead, she stood on the edge of a new life, a place that would test her in ways she could never have prepared for. Her mother had been the first to speak, her tone dismissive, almost relieved. "You're a burden, Margaret, a constant reminder of our shame." Her words stung, but it wasn't the first time they had been said. Her mother had been cold in the best of times, and now, with her younger sister's pregnancy just announced, her cruelty was magnified. "Maybe out west, you could start over, find something useful to do with your life." Ruth's laugh, sharp and condescending, followed. "I'll have children of my own soon, and give our parents what they wanted." "You never could." Margaret stood still, not able to speak. Her father's gaze was fixed on the ground, not meeting her eyes, a sign that he had already given up. In their world, her worth was determined by her ability to bear children. Without that, she had become invisible to them. It was only a matter of time before they would have her leave. With a quiet nod, her father handed her the ticket. No goodbye, no comfort, just this simple instruction: go. The train ride to the west felt longer than it was. 3 weeks. A lifetime. The first few days had been filled with thoughts of escape, an attempt to outrun the pain, the shame. But as the landscape shifted, so too did the weight in her chest. She watched as the green fields of the east turned into the barren hills of the west. The land was harsh, unforgiving, and so was the silence that surrounded her. In the crowded train car, she was just another face, lost in the sea of strangers who were headed toward new lives. None of them knew her story. None of them would care. She found herself alone more often than not. Her only companion, the endless stretch of dirt and sky outside her window. The sun, relentless in its heat, cast shadows on her soul, and yet there was a sense of inevitability. This was the life she had been given, and it was inescapable. When the train finally pulled into the small California town, Margaret couldn't help but feel like a piece of broken glass, misplaced in a world that didn't care. The people around her were rough, hardened by the land, and they didn't spare a second glance. As she disembarked, a woman with wild, unkempt hair and a steely gaze approached her. "So, you're the barren one, huh?" The words hit her like a slap, and she nodded, not knowing what else to say. This was Aunt Martha, her only family out west, and from the look on her face, she didn't seem much warmer than the people who had sent her here. Aunt Martha's cattle ranch was not the home Margaret had imagined. It was everything she had feared: vast, unyielding, and full of hard, back-breaking work. The house was small, almost a shack, and the land around it was unforgiving, filled with brush, rocks, and the occasional wild animal. There was no room for weakness here. The first few days were brutal. Margaret wasn't used to the labor. She had spent most of her life inside, reading, sewing, and keeping house. Now, she was hauling feed, repairing fences, and learning to navigate the terrain of a place that seemed to hold no sympathy for her. Aunt Martha's harsh voice echoed in her mind. Shame won't feed cattle. It was a cruel lesson, but a necessary one. There was no room for softness in this place. The physical toll was only part of the challenge. The emotional weight was heavier. Margaret overheard some of the ranch hands talking one evening as she prepared the evening meal. Poor thing, one of them said, she doesn't belong here. She's got no man, no children, just a useless woman, out here to die. Margaret froze, the words stinging as if they had been spoken directly to her. She felt their pity like a cloak, one she couldn't shake off. They didn't understand. But then again, they didn't need to. The days blurred together, and slowly, Margaret began to lose herself in the work. She wasn't broken, though it sometimes felt like she was. But maybe, just maybe in this hard land, she could find a new version of herself. Something stronger, something capable. She could still hear her family's voices in her head, but they were growing faint, like echoes in an empty room. And for the first time in years, Margaret wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could begin to build a life worth living. And so, as the sun set on her first week in California, Margaret stood at the edge of the ranch, staring into the distance. It wasn't the life she had expected, but it was hers now. The West might have sent her here in shame, but she wasn't going to let that define her. The journey had just begun. The harsh reality of frontier life quickly began to take its toll on Margaret. Aunt Martha had been clear from the start. This wasn't a place for weakness, and there would be no room for tears. But Margaret couldn't help it. The work was endless. Days spent in the scorching heat mending fences, hauling water, and tending to cattle. Her body, then used to such grueling labor, ached in places she never thought could hurt. Each morning, she rose exhausted, her limbs stiff and sore, only to face another long, unforgiving day. Aunt Martha, gruff and unsympathetic, would bark orders, expecting nothing less than perfection. No one cares about your tears, she would snap. This land doesn't care about your womb. It cares about your spine. The words stung, but there was no denying their truth. Margaret had no choice but to push through the pain, her pride in tatters. There were moments when it felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She had no family here, no friends, only this vast, barren land and the constant reminder of what she had left behind. One of the lowest points came when she helped a ranch hand's wife deliver a baby. Margaret had no experience with childbirth, and the experience of seeing new life come into the world while she herself felt so empty was crushing. Afterward, alone in the small cabin she called home, Margaret wept for the life she had imagined, one filled with love, family, and children of her own. Aunt Martha, hearing her cries, came in, sat beside her, and said simply, "This land doesn't care if you're broken. It only cares if you're strong enough to survive it." The harshness of her words didn't make Margaret feel better, but something in them finally clicked. There was no room for self-pity here. It wasn't just survival that was at stake, it was her ability to redefine herself. As the weeks passed, Margaret slowly began to adapt. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the thought of going back home, if only to escape the relentless work, felt almost unbearable. But with each passing day, she grew stronger. She learned how to handle a rifle, how to break a horse, and how to care for the cattle with the same skill and expertise as any of the men who worked the land. It wasn't just about physical strength either. Margaret began to find a quiet sense of pride in herself. She realized she was capable of things she never thought possible. In a strange way, this harsh, unforgiving life was beginning to teach her who she was. It wasn't until she met Doc Harriet, a frontier doctor who was as unconventional as they came, that Margaret began to understand how much more there was to discover about herself. Doc Harriet was unlike any woman Margaret had ever known. Intelligent, independent, and fiercely independent. She had no time for the conventional roles women were supposed to play and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. "This land is tough on a woman," Doc Harriet told Margaret one day as they sat together in the small cabin. But we're tougher. You just have to learn to take the punches and keep going. The woman's words stayed with Margaret. Doc Harriet wasn't just a doctor. She was a lifeline in a world that had no room for weakness. There was also Rosa, the ranch hand's wife, who took Margaret under her wing, teaching her the language of the land. Rosa was kind, practical, and had an innate wisdom about life that Margaret admired. The woman's infectious laughter and gentle demeanor helped Margaret find moments of peace amid the chaos. They became friends in a way that Margaret hadn't expected. Rosa, with her nurturing warmth, became the kind of friend Margaret had missed for so long. It was from Rosa that Margaret first learned how to truly survive the daily grind of ranch life. Slowly, but surely, Margaret started to emerge from the shell she had built around herself. The work didn't stop being hard, but it became familiar. The exhaustion became a companion, and the pain, though still there, didn't feel as all-consuming as it had before. She began to take pride in the work she did, no longer feeling like an outsider, but an integral part of the ranch. Still, it wasn't all progress. One day, a letter arrived from her family in the East. It was from Ruth, her younger sister, and the news was painful. Ruth had gotten engaged, and their mother had written a note at the end of the letter that stung like salt in an open wound. "She's pregnant," the note read. "At least she will give us the grandchildren you never could." Margaret read those words over and over again, feeling the familiar sting of rejection and shame. The letter's cold finality made her feel as if nothing had changed. She was still the broken daughter, the one who couldn't meet the expectations of the family. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, wandering the ranch, lost in her thoughts. That night, Aunt Martha found her sitting alone, her face pale and distant. "You gonna let them define you?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Margaret didn't answer at first. What could she say? Could she let her family continue to hold this power over her, even from thousands of miles away? But Aunt Martha wasn't done. "Those letters don't matter, Margaret. What matters is what you make of this. What matters is you." Margaret looked up at Aunt Martha, the anger and sadness mixing in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let her family's cruelty be the end of her story. She wasn't just a barren woman. She was a woman who had survived the hardest part of her life, and she was still standing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Margaret didn't know it yet, but the life she had been sent to create out here was one she would own. She wasn't defined by her past. She would build a new future, one piece at a time. And for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The days on the ranch began to blend together as Margaret settled into a new rhythm. The exhaustion of physical labor no longer felt as unbearable as it had in the beginning. Her muscles were stronger now, and the work had become second nature. However, a different kind of restlessness started to grow inside her, a curiosity about Samuel, the neighboring ranch owner. He had appeared in her life slowly, first as a figure on the horizon when she worked the fields, and then as a frequent visitor to Aunt Martha's ranch. Samuel was a widower, much like her, and though they hadn't exchanged many words, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Samuel was a man who didn't dwell on the past. His quiet, steady presence was a stark contrast to her own tumultuous thoughts. He never made her feel like she was less because of her history, and in his presence, she felt more like a person than a label. They often worked together, tending to cattle, fixing fences, or riding out to inspect the land, and their companionship grew naturally. At first, their conversations were simple, practical exchanges about ranch work, the weather, and the cattle, but over time, they began to open up to each other. Samuel was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with a depth that Margaret appreciated. One afternoon, while repairing a fence in the dusty heat, Samuel asked her about her past. It wasn't a probing question, just a quiet inquiry, but it caught Margaret off guard. She hesitated, then gave him the brief version of her story: the death of her husband, the doctor's diagnosis, her family's rejection. He listened without judgment, simply nodding as she spoke, and when she finished, he didn't offer sympathy. He didn't need to. He simply said, "I understand what it's like to lose someone you love. I lost my wife and child 3 years ago. It changes you, but you don't have to carry it alone." His words weren't empty, and in that moment, Margaret realized he saw her not for her inability to bear children, but as someone who had survived immense loss. It was an unexpected bond, one she hadn't known she was looking for. After that day, Samuel and Margaret's connection deepened. They began to seek each other out, not just for work, but for companionship. He never treated her as broken, as her family had, and that made all the difference. Despite the growing affection she felt for him, Margaret couldn't shake the fear that had been with her for years. The fear that intimacy would lead to more pain, that she would never be able to give him what he wanted. Samuel never pressured her, though, never asked for more than she was willing to give. He was patient, letting their friendship grow naturally. Aunt Martha, ever the realist, noticed the change between them. One evening, as Margaret was tending to the kitchen, Aunt Martha leaned against the doorframe and studied her quietly. "That's a good man," she said, a rare moment of softness in her voice. "Rare out here. You'd be lucky to have him." Margaret didn't know how to respond. She hadn't thought about it in those terms. Samuel was just someone she enjoyed being around, someone who made her feel seen in a way that had become foreign to her. But Aunt Martha's words lingered in her mind, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret allowed herself to consider the possibility of something more. It wasn't until weeks later, after several more shared meals and long conversations by the fire, that Samuel asked Margaret to dinner. It wasn't an extravagant request, just a simple meal in his cabin, but Margaret recoiled, feeling the weight of her own fears. She knew what this was: an invitation to something deeper, something that could lead to disappointment, to loss, to more heartbreak. "I can't," she said quickly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Samuel didn't press her, but the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. "I'm not asking for answers," he said softly. "I'm asking for your company, nothing more." His gentle persistence wore her down, and finally, after a few more days of avoiding him, Margaret agreed. The dinner was quiet, simple. There were no grand gestures, no promises. Just two people sharing a meal, sitting in the same space, feeling the pull of something undefined. Afterward, as the evening faded into the soft glow of the fire, Samuel looked at her, his gaze steady. "I'm not asking for children," he said, his voice low but clear. "I'm asking for a chance. For us. For whatever that could be." Margaret's heart raced, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't fully process. She started, her voice faltering. "I can't give you children. I can't." Samuel reached across the table, his hand gentle but firm. "Did I ask you for children?" He interrupted softly. "I asked you for dinner. I asked you to be here with me. That's enough for me." His words hit her like a wave, sweeping away the doubt and fear that had held her back for so long. He wasn't asking her to be something she wasn't. He was asking for a chance to build something together, something beyond what either of them had lost. And in that moment, Margaret felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't what she had imagined her life would be, but it was real. Samuel wasn't asking for her to be anything other than herself, and that was enough. Over the next few months, they spent more time together, building a partnership based on respect, understanding, and shared grief. The idea of a future with Samuel didn't seem so frightening anymore. He wasn't trying to replace what she had lost. He was simply offering the possibility of something new. And as the spring approached, with its promise of renewal, Samuel finally asked the question that had been lingering between them for months. "Will you marry me?" The proposal was simple, with no grand gesture, no flowers or diamonds, just a quiet promise between two people who had seen the worst of life and were still willing to try. Margaret said yes, though a part of her still feared the unknown, still felt the weight of her family's rejection. They would marry soon, in the spring, when the land would begin to bloom again. But Margaret didn't invite her family to the wedding. There was still too much pain there, too many old wounds that hadn't healed. This was her new life, one she had built from the ground up, and it would be marked not by her family's judgment, but by her own choices. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt ready for whatever the future might hold. The spring wedding was simple but beautiful, held in a small clearing near the ranch, with only a handful of neighbors and a few trusted hands from the ranch in attendance. Margaret, wearing a plain but lovely white dress Aunt Martha had helped her make, stood beside Samuel, her hands trembling slightly, but her heart filled with a quiet certainty. The ceremony was brief, with no grand promises, only the understanding that they were both choosing to walk forward into the unknown, side by side. When the ceremony ended, Samuel kissed her gently, and though it wasn't a moment of great passion, it was one of deep connection, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together, no matter what came. For Margaret, the marriage was the start of something new, something she hadn't thought possible just a year ago. She had left behind the broken parts of herself, the shame and the rejection, and had stepped into a life of her own making. The days that followed were full of small joys, waking up to the sound of Samuel starting the fire, working together on the ranch, and sharing meals with the small community they had built. Samuel proved to be a devoted partner, never asking for more than she was able to give and always offering his support when she needed it. They worked as equals, their roles on the ranch intertwined, with Margaret finding herself fully immersed in the responsibilities of running the land alongside him. Despite the joy of her new life, there was a lingering fear, a nagging worry at the back of her mind. The wound from her past still hurt, even if it wasn't as sharp as it had once been. As the months passed, Margaret found herself growing anxious, wondering if she would ever conceive. She had accepted that perhaps her body would never bear children, and though the idea of raising a family with Samuel was a dream she clung to, she had learned to accept that some dreams were just too far out of reach. Then, one summer afternoon, everything changed. Margaret began to feel unwell, nauseous, exhausted, and with a strange heaviness she couldn't shake. At first, she brushed it off as the result of too much work, too many hours in the sun. But when the symptoms didn't fade, she knew something was wrong. Samuel, ever the patient husband, insisted that she see Doc Harriet. The doctor arrived with her usual calm and steady demeanor, and after a thorough examination, she paused for a moment before speaking. "Margaret," she said slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, "you're not sick. You're pregnant. About 3 months along." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The words seemed impossible. She had been told she was barren, that she would never bear children, and yet here she was being told she was pregnant. It didn't make sense. Doc Harriet's smile deepened as she continued. "It's a miracle, Margaret. Maybe the doctor from your past was wrong, or maybe your body just needed time. But you're pregnant." The news was both thrilling and terrifying. Margaret's mind raced with fear. What if she lost the baby? What if it wasn't real? Her body had failed her before, and now, as the life inside her grew, she couldn't help but wonder if it was too good to be true. Samuel, though, was overjoyed. He held her hand, his eyes filled with a quiet wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. "We're going to be parents," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret couldn't answer him at first. The fear she had carried for so long was overwhelming. But as she looked into Samuel's eyes, she saw not just love, but a shared hope for the future. She wasn't sure what would happen, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of faith that things could be different. As the months passed, Margaret's pregnancy progressed, but with it came a sense of disbelief. She kept the news a secret from the community, afraid to share the miracle until she was sure it was real. Doc Harriet helped her through the early stages, keeping a watchful eye on her health. But still, Margaret couldn't quite bring herself to believe it. She told herself that she wouldn't tell anyone until she was certain, and with each passing month, her joy and fear grew in equal measure. At 5 months, the doubt was still there, but she couldn't deny the changes happening in her body. She was growing, and with that growth came the strangest sense of hope she'd ever felt. But it wasn't until she was 6 months along, when she visited Doc Harriet for a routine checkup, that the news became truly overwhelming. Doc Harriet smiled again, her hands on Margaret's stomach. "Margaret," she said, her voice calm, "there's something I need to tell you. There are 2 heartbeats. You're carrying twins." The revelation hit Margaret like a wave, crashing over her in an overwhelming surge of emotions. Two babies. The impossible had become real, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to hope. The months that followed were a blur of excitement and anxiety. The pregnancy, though difficult, was full of moments of wonder and fear. Samuel was by her side every step of the way, his devotion unwavering as he cared for her and supported her in ways she hadn't known she needed. The ranch community, though they hadn't spoken of it openly, seemed to recognize the change in Margaret. The quiet respect they had always given her shifted into something more, something that felt like acceptance, like belonging. When Margaret reached the 8th month of her pregnancy, she finally announced the news to the community. The response was overwhelming. The women of the town, who had watched her struggle in silence, now gathered around her with warm congratulations and excitement. They had witnessed her transformation from the broken, shamed woman who had arrived in California to the strong, capable woman who was about to become a mother. Margaret's heart swelled as she realized just how far she had come. She wasn't just having children. She was reclaiming the life that had once been stolen from her. The miracle of her pregnancy was not just about the babies growing inside her, but about the woman she had become. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that she would write with Samuel by her side, and no longer would she be defined by the wounds of her past. The labor came unexpectedly, and it was unlike anything Margaret had ever imagined. What had started as a quiet evening on the ranch quickly turned into the frantic, overwhelming experience of childbirth. The early hours were painful but manageable, though as the night dragged on, the contractions became unbearable. Margaret, exhausted and trembling, gripped Samuel's hand as he tried to comfort her, his face a mask of concern. The ranch was miles from the nearest doctor, and while Doc Harriet had made her way over earlier in the evening, it was clear that the birth was going to be a long and difficult one. For hours, Margaret labored in the small cabin, her body racked with pain, as Samuel did his best to ease her. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so vulnerable, so helpless, but in the presence of Samuel, she felt safe. When the first baby finally came, Margaret's breath caught in her throat as the tiny girl was placed in her arms. The child's hair was golden, her skin soft and warm, and as Margaret gazed down at her daughter, she couldn't help but weep. It wasn't just the joy of becoming a mother. It was the overwhelming realization that she was no longer broken. She was whole. The second birth came not long after, and this time, the pain was sharper, more intense. But when the baby boy was born, Margaret's heart swelled with a love she had never known. He had dark hair, his little face scrunched up in surprise at the world. As she held him close, a sense of awe washed over her. Two children. 2 perfect lives she had brought into the world. It was a miracle. Doc Harriet, ever calm, watched the scene unfold with quiet pride. "You've done it, Margaret," she said softly. "You've brought 2 beautiful lives into this world." Samuel, his eyes misty with emotion, kissed her forehead. "I knew you could do it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. In the days that followed, Margaret was consumed with the overwhelming love she felt for her children, Clara and James. They were her joy, her future, and they quickly became the center of her world. But despite the joy of motherhood, There was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind. She had received a letter from the East, her family's letter. Her sister's marriage was failing, their mother's health was deteriorating, and her father had requested a visit. They had heard about the twins, of course. The news had spread, and for the first time since she left, her parents were reaching out, asking to see her. Margaret's heart was torn. She felt the old wounds open as the words on the letter burned in her mind. Her mother's sharp tone, the cruelty of her rejection, and the years of silence. It all came flooding back. Yet, something had changed. She wasn't the same broken woman who had left them years ago. She had a family now, her own family, and a life that had meaning and purpose. Samuel, ever patient, understood her struggle. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, he took her hand. "I know you're hurting, Margaret," he said softly, "but you don't need their approval anymore. You've built something beautiful here. You've built something real. I'm not asking you to forgive them. I'm asking you to decide what you need." Margaret looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She had spent so many years trying to earn her family's love, seeking approval from people who had never truly understood her. She had spent so much time believing that their judgment was the thing that defined her. But now, looking at her children and Samuel, she realized that they were what mattered. Her family back east might never accept her, might never fully understand the choices she had made, but she was finally free of their expectations. Still, the question lingered. What would closure look like? Could she ever truly find peace with her family? Would seeing them again bring any sense of resolution, or would it just reopen old wounds? Aunt Martha, ever wise and straightforward, offered her insight. "You don't owe them anything, Margaret. Those babies are yours. They're not theirs. They never were, and they never will be. You don't need their approval to know your mother. You've proven that every day since those babies were born." Doc Harriet, always blunt but caring, added her own perspective. "Sometimes, going back to where the pain started helps you realize that the pain no longer has power over you. It's not about seeking their blessing. It's about seeing that you've grown past them. You've built your own family, and nothing can change that." After much thought, Margaret made her decision. She would go back to the East, but it wouldn't be for reconciliation. It would be to show herself, to stand before the people who had rejected her and prove that they no longer held power over her. She would go, not to seek their forgiveness, but to witness her own transformation. With Samuel's support, she made plans for the journey. It would only be a short visit, 2 weeks at most, just enough time to show them the life she had created. She would return to California, her true home, with her children, her family, and her sense of self intact. The journey east was quiet, filled with a sense of finality. Samuel was by her side, holding Clara while Margaret cradled James as they traveled by train toward the place that had once been her home. The closer they got, the more Margaret felt a mixture of emotions. There was still pain, of course, but there was something else too, a quiet confidence, a knowing that she didn't need their validation anymore. She had created something far more beautiful than their approval could ever be. The twins, now 18 months old, slept peacefully in their laps as the train rumbled on toward the town she had once called home. Margaret knew that whatever happened when they arrived, it wouldn't change who she had become. She was no longer the broken woman they had sent away. She was whole, strong, and ready to face whatever came next. As the train pulled into the small town, Margaret felt a strange mixture of anticipation and calm. The familiar sights of her childhood, old buildings, narrow streets, and the church where she had once prayed for a life she thought she would never have, were now a distant echo. She had thought that returning here would bring her some sense of closure, but instead, she felt as though she was stepping into a different life entirely. Samuel stood by her side, holding James in his arms. Clara nestled safely in Margaret's hold. The town was small, its residents still carrying on with the same old routines, and when they disembarked, the buzz of quiet whispers rippled through the crowd. Margaret could feel the eyes on her, the judgment, the curiosity. Some people had recognized her instantly, their faces shifting from surprise to something else, perhaps guilt, perhaps disbelief. The physician who had once declared her barren was there, too, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. Ruth, her younger sister, stood near the back of the crowd, her eyes filled with something far darker than Margaret had anticipated: envy. Margaret's father, older now, stood beside her mother, who had aged prematurely, her face etched with regret. The years had not been kind to them, and Margaret couldn't help but notice the weariness in their eyes. When her mother reached out to take Clara from her, Margaret instinctively pulled back, the old wound opening fresh. Her mother's touch, which had once been cold and demanding, now felt foreign, unwanted. "Her name is Clara," Margaret said, her voice steady but firm. "She doesn't know you." The words were sharp, but they were the truth. She wasn't going to let her mother claim anything, least of all the children that were hers and Samuel's. The confrontation that followed was inevitable. They all gathered at her family's home, the place where Margaret had grown up, but it was no longer a place of comfort. The walls seemed smaller now, the room suffocating, and her father's silence was as oppressive as it had ever been. Her mother, though, was the first to speak. Her voice was strained, almost apologetic, though it still carried that faint undercurrent of control. "We always knew you'd find your way, Margaret," she said, her words hollow, as though trying to claim some false sense of ownership. But Margaret wasn't having it. She couldn't let them rewrite the narrative of her life any longer. She had endured their rejection for too long. "Stop," Margaret cut in, her voice cold and unyielding. "You don't get to claim them. You sent me away because you were ashamed." The words hit her mother like a slap, but Margaret wasn't finished. "You handed me a ticket and told me I'd brought shame to this family. You told me I'd never be a mother, and you didn't write for 2 years. Not a single word. I wasn't your daughter anymore. You made sure of that." Her mother opened her mouth to protest, but Margaret didn't let her speak. "You don't get to decide who I am anymore. You don't get to claim my children. These children will grow up knowing they are wanted. Everything you taught me I wasn't." Her father finally spoke, his voice hesitant, worn. "Maybe we were wrong," he muttered, but it didn't carry the weight of an apology. It wasn't enough. Margaret's anger swelled. "I'm not here for reconciliation," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm here to show you what you threw away, to show you what you didn't want to see, the woman I've become, the family I've built, and the life I've created. You may never accept me, but I've moved on, and I'm not going to let you destroy what I've made." The tension in the room was thick, but Margaret stood firm. Samuel was beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder that her future was no longer tied to the past. Her younger sister, Ruth, couldn't hold back anymore. "You think you're better than us now?" she spat, her voice bitter with jealousy. "You've come back with your fancy husband and your perfect children, but we have our lives, too. You don't get to look down on us." But Margaret was unmoved. "I'm not looking down on you. I'm standing here because I want you to see who I've become. I'm not the broken girl you rejected. I'm stronger than I've ever been, and I'm not afraid of you anymore." Ruth's words hung in the air, but Margaret wasn't interested in her bitterness. She had been a prisoner to their cruelty for too long, and now it was time to let go of that past once and for all. The conversation shifted, but Margaret knew there was nothing more to say. Her mother's manipulations, her father's indifference, and Ruth's jealousy no longer had power over her. This was the life she had built, and she would defend it, not for them, but for herself. The next day, the town came together for a church social, a gathering that was meant to be a show of community, but felt more like a final reckoning. The women who had once gossiped about Margaret behind her back now watched her with a mixture of envy and awe. The physician who had declared her barren greeted her with a stiff smile, his earlier judgment now an uncomfortable memory. "Your children are beautiful," he said awkwardly, but Margaret, in a rare moment of composure, simply nodded. "Yes, despite your declaration," she replied, her tone leaving no room for further discussion. There was no revenge in her words, only truth. In a quiet moment after the social, Margaret's father approached her. The years had taken their toll on him, and the sorrow in his eyes was unmistakable. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I can't undo the past, but I want you to know I regret what we did to you." For the first time in years, Margaret saw something resembling a man in her father. The words weren't much, but they were all he could offer, and in that moment, it was enough. "I forgive you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I won't forget the way you treated me, but I'm moving on." There were no more words between them. Margaret had set the boundary, and for the first time in her life, she had the power to decide who stayed in her life and who didn't. She wasn't looking for closure anymore. She had already found it. The pain, though it would never fully fade, no longer defined her. The past had no claim over her future. As she left her childhood home behind and stepped back into her life with Samuel, she knew that what had happened in that house would stay there. Her true family was waiting for her in California, and it was there that she would raise her children, build her future, and live the life she had always deserved. The reckoning had come, and Margaret was finally free. The journey back to California was quiet, and Margaret felt the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders with every passing mile. The train that had carried her to the east now carried her back to the place where she had found herself, the place where she had reclaimed her strength and her life. Samuel sat beside her, holding Clara in his arms, while James nestled in Margaret's lap, his small body warm and comforted by the steady rhythm of the train. The twins, now 2 years old, were growing so fast, and every day with them felt like a gift she had once thought impossible. Looking out of the window at the vast, open land rolling by, Margaret could feel herself returning to the freedom that California had offered her, the freedom to live without the constraints of family expectations, without the weight of judgment that had once defined her existence. It had taken years for her to realize that her family's rejection had nothing to do with her worth. It was their failure to see her, their inability to understand that she was more than the labels they had placed on her. As the train rumbled on, Margaret reflected on how far she had come. She had started this journey as a woman broken by grief, rejected by her own family, and condemned by her own body's inability to bear children. Now, she was returning as a woman who had built a life from the ground up, a woman who had created a family of her own, with a husband who loved her and children who filled her heart with joy. When the train finally pulled into the station in California, Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and peace settle over her. This was home, the place where she had found herself, where she had learned the value of hard work, perseverance, and independence. The place where she had shed the weight of the past and become someone entirely new. Aunt Martha was waiting for them on the platform, her face a mixture of gruffness and affection. When she saw them, her usual tough exterior softened, and she rushed forward, wrapping Margaret in a tight hug. "Took you long enough," Aunt Martha grumbled, though her eyes sparkled with pride. "You got lighter," she said, her voice filled with an emotion Margaret had never expected from her. "Good," she added, her tone softening even more. Margaret smiled, feeling the warmth of her chosen family surrounding her. Doc Harriet was there too, standing beside Aunt Martha, her usual stern expression breaking into a rare smile as she reached out to embrace Margaret. "You're free," she said simply, and Margaret nodded, her heart full. "I am. Finally," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. As they made their way out of the station, the community that had been with Margaret from the very beginning greeted her with open arms. The women of the ranch, who had watched her grow and change over the years, were there to celebrate her return. Rosa, with her ever-present warmth, swept Clara and James into her arms, speaking to them in the Spanish they had picked up over the years. and Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude. It wasn't just the land that had become home to her. It was the people who had accepted her, who had supported her, and stood by her when she needed it most. They were her family now, the ones who had shown her what true belonging meant. As they rode up to the ranch, the twins squealed in delight as they recognized the familiar sights. The ranch house, the fields, the barn, all of it was home to them, just as it had become home to Margaret. She could feel the weight of years of rejection and pain lifting from her as she saw the joy in the twins' faces. They had grown up in this place, and now they were back to stay. The moment they stepped inside the house, it felt like the world had shifted. This was where Margaret truly belonged, surrounded by the people who had helped her rebuild her life. It wasn't perfect. Life on the ranch was still hard, and there were challenges ahead, but it was hers. She had made it her own, and in doing so, had found a sense of peace she had never known. Over dinner that evening, surrounded by the warmth of Aunt Martha, Doc Harriet, Rosa, and the other ranch hands who had become like family, Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude. The laughter that filled the room, the stories shared, and the sense of community were everything she had longed for in her past, but had never found until now. For the first time in years, Margaret could finally relax and enjoy the simple, beautiful life she had built. Later that evening, as she tucked Clara and James into bed, Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. The twins, now peacefully asleep, represented everything she had fought for. The life that had once seemed impossible was now a reality. As she sat beside them, her hand resting gently on their tiny heads, Margaret thought about the journey she had taken to get here. She had left behind a family that had rejected her, that had told her she wasn't enough, and in doing so, she had found her true self. She had created a family that loved her for who she was, not for what she could give them. And she had finally realized that it wasn't the approval of her blood relatives that had made her strong. It was the love and support of the people who had chosen to stand by her. The next morning, Margaret stood on the porch, watching as the sun rose over the ranch. The twins were running around, their laughter filling the air as they played with the other children from the ranch. Samuel came up beside her, wrapping his arm around her waist. "You okay?" he asked, his voice filled with the quiet concern that had always been one of his most endearing qualities. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of the past finally lifting. "I am. Actually, yes." She smiled up at him, her heart full. "I don't need their approval. I never did, but I needed to know that I didn't need it." As the day stretched on, Margaret realized just how far she had come. She had started this journey as a woman who had been cast aside, ashamed of who she was, and now she was a woman who had built her own life. She had created a family, not just of blood, but of love. She had created a life that was truly hers, one where she didn't need anyone else's validation to know her worth. The future seemed full of possibilities, and Margaret knew that whatever challenges came her way, she was ready for them. She had faced rejection, loss, and heartbreak, and yet she had emerged stronger, more determined, and more whole than she had ever been. She was no longer the woman who had been sent west in shame. She was a woman who had built a life that was rich with love, hard work, and the knowledge that she was enough, just as she was. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret stood on the porch, looking out at the land that had become her home. The wind ruffled her hair, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. This was her life, and she had earned every bit of it. The story of the barren daughter was over, and the story of a woman who had triumphed over adversity, who had built her own family, had only just begun. It was a story of resilience, of love, and of the freedom to live life on her own terms. The next chapter was hers to write, and she was ready.